The next segment also deals with international free trade and with exploring new global strategies to clean open markets. Um, I wanted to give, and if people have to sign off at 4 o'clock, I understand, but maybe we, to respect the conversation, we'll stay on as long as we can. But I did want to, uh, uh, Julian, with your permission, I'd like to give our fellow co-host, Charles Hernick, an opportunity to say a few words about an idea that they've been working on. And I believe that this is very, very important. And I will, and I think Charles knows why I think it's important. So I'll let him speak for me and weigh in if I need to. But, Charles, please tell us what you've been working on.
Sure. Thanks, Rod. I appreciate the attention here and the numerous participants from around the U.S. And I know that we have some global attendance here too. So thank you for that. And Rod, I'll try to be succinct, but I think that the key message that is coming across in what I've been listening to, a lot of folks interested in expanding market competition, expanding trade, and really tackling in a meaningful way the clean energy transition and climate crisis that we know we need to get busy and handle. For that reason, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, my organization, has been the champion of an idea that would help provide, in a limited government way, help provide more visibility and reduce barriers for folks to engage in carbon markets and specifically in offsets. I think that there's been robust efforts in all sorts of different directions to reduce emissions from smokestacks, from tailpipes, from all different emission sources. But we know that if we're going to reduce emissions in a meaningful way globally, we also need to focus on the offsets. And if we can do that in a way that is low cost, we will be able to, and provides high information and assurance to whoever's buying the offset, will have done a good thing. So CRES has worked with a handful of senators and representatives in what we've seen introduced as a bipartisan, bicameral climate bill. So I should repeat that: bipartisan, both houses of Congress, climate bill called the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which focuses on empowering farmers, land managers, in terms of foresters and ranchers, to be able to develop carbon offset credits on their land and sell them on a voluntary basis to corporations or individuals who want to reduce their emissions and lessen their carbon footprint. We know the math works. We've got a smart group of people here. I don't need to dive into the details of how carbon offsets work and why they're necessary. But you see that there is surging demand for zero emissions or low emissions sources and options like offsets. Every day, if you open up the Wall Street Journal or whatever newspaper you're reading, there's another company that's focused on getting to net zero over the course of the next 2 decades. There are other states and municipalities, religious institutions, universities, you name it. Folks are aiming to reduce their emissions. Purchasing carbon offsets will be a major part of how they do it. It's written into almost every plan. And what we want to be able to do is assure that America's farmers and ranchers can participate in this market. Right now, they're responsible for about 10% of US emissions. But if we provide a mechanism where they can get paid to reduce their emissions, they can diversify their income, it will help the family farm, it will help local forestry operations, be good for generating local revenue and income, and make it so that mandates and caps don't affect that particular industry. So that's a smaller subset of a broader idea that CRES works on called a voluntary framework that would help do the same thing for other sectors, but basically provide more information and accountability and transparency into these voluntary commitments and really allow the power of markets to help guide emissions downward. So that's really what I wanted to share with you all. And thanks, Rod, for making a few minutes here. I'd be happy to answer any questions, Rod, or expand on an angle that you wanted to make sure that I covered.
Well, let me just say that one of the things that I find, really intriguing about your effort is that this is not a mandated carbon market. This is a voluntary carbon market, which is a different thing. It's not imposing a tax on people, a hidden tax. These are corporations that have decided they want to lower their emissions and are going to, do carbon market trading to get there.
Yep.
And these are farmers who want to take advantage of that. So it makes all the sense in the world. What I really particularly like about this also is that, paradigms like clean tax cuts really work when you have sectors where you have well-defined metrics that are well understood and agreed upon. What you're developing here with the Growing Climate Solutions Act is a set of standards so that you could use clean tax cuts in agriculture once you have those metrics developed. So what you're doing is going to open up new policy opportunities. And further than that, I think you're going to open up cross-border policy opportunities. For instance, what if Canada joined in the Growing Climate Solutions Act and you were able to trade offsets? What if you were able to use offsets, these voluntary offsets, as a carrot for international free trade and competition? As an incentive to encourage countries to move to more of a private property rights framework in the rainforest, for instance, where that is desperately needed for conservation. So I think that this is I think that there's a couple of steps to go with this concept, but I think that it leads in a very interesting direction. Now,
Yeah.
we're running short on time, as I said, and we're going to extend things. But I did ask to see if any of our panelists have to go, and Jim Connaughton will have to go in 9 minutes. So, and then we're going to continue the conversation that we're running behind on with Julian in the lead. But Jim, do you have any thoughts on what you've heard about ways to, new global strategies for clean open markets? What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm going to focus on two things. One is new and old, and the other is not something we've discussed yet. It is a fact that what's been going on internationally around this subject is there's been a proxy war that's being fought due to the inability of the international participants to just agree on a binding target for greenhouse gases. So in the absence of an internationally enforceable agreement with a binding target for greenhouse gases, like we have for everything else, like ozone depleting substances, everything's a proxy war, which is why we're getting all these distortions. So I have a very particular thesis at the international level, and it's certainly true at the US level, that if you only focused on an internationally enforceable binding target, if we said, what is our emissions target, all this other stuff is going to get resolved a lot faster. But in the absence of that, it's proxy war for the end of time. So I just want to make that point. In America, for example, and this is a key example, the US government in 2007, bipartisan agreed to a lighting efficiency standard, 70% in 10 years. It ended up becoming disfavored by the right, and they cut off all the budget for it. But because it was enacted into US law, in the absence of any government dollars and any government regulatory program, we got 100% compliance ahead of time with net addition to consumer welfare, well documented by ACEEE. Look at their report on this, because it was a law, And so there was no implementing mechanisms, and the whole market went crazy and wildly successful, which also meant that the rest of the world is now getting LEDs ubiquitously deployed with no regulation in the rest of the world. Because we drove the price down, put the supply chain up, the market was big enough to do that. And so just something simple and clever was wildly successful and globally valuable. So that's at the top line. So all it takes is one major market to just do that and do it for real, and everything falls into place. Below the top line, highly disaggregated, is the world of international standards. So an exception to discrimination under the World Trade Organization is international standards. So if you get the international community to come together with consensus on technical standards, those are respected under the WTO if those are then enacted into national regulation law or other other activities. So this is a bottom-up way to create a roadmap for advancing new energies, new technologies, new services. And I'll give the example I will give there is eco-labeling standards. So ISO created eco-labeling standards, and those ended up getting adopted into national law. And now we're working on a new set. I think Ronald was really, what he's talking about is very interesting. But that is a way to accelerate and expand very bottom up, driven by the market participants to create these standards. One closing point on this, in the US, there's a law called the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act, 1996, which provides that if there is a consensus international standard on any topic, it's actually not limited.
Consensus national standard.
Shall be used. What's that?
It's a consensus national standard.
What's that?
It's a consensus national standard.
No, the consensus international standard, actually, in the NTAA. Yeah, if there's a standard on this consensus standard, I'm sorry, Julian, to get a consensus national, international that gets adopted as an ANSI standard. You are correct. Yeah. But in any event, under that act, it shall be used in regulation, or it shall be used and referred to in the context of government procurement. It's wildly underutilized in this space, but it's a way you can drive markets, but with consensus and with technical input and economic awareness and other things that are currently lacking in sort of the negotiated, legislated, or treaty environment. So it has all the characteristics of having to have real market saliency. So I give you those two ideas, and I regret that I must sign off, but really enjoyed participating in this with all of you.
Thank you so much, Jim. That's really, really helpful insights. Actually, I love the idea of international standards for various reasons. Actually, one would be, and I'd love comments from Ronald and from Shankar and anybody else who wants to chime in on the importance, the potential importance of standards that would have to be there to underpin any international agreement that seeks to address reductions in carbon emissions or other environmental criteria as a condition for reducing barriers to trade. I mean, it seems like ACCTS is going to have to do that. It's going to have to adopt some kind of standards. You've talked about the list of goods, which is more sort of technologically specific, but is it possible to go abstract away from that and just develop standards that could be applied to any technology that sort of conforms and thereby would be able to benefit from these reductions in barriers?
Julian, we have one participant that is going to need to go and can't stay on. So let Bruce, how long can you stay with us? Bruce Laurie?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rod. Yeah, I can stay for a few more minutes. I'm supposed to be on a call at 4, so I should probably not be too late for that.
Well, but, okay, maybe Bruce, you could give us a few insights from your perspective on what's happening in Canada.
Just a second, we will have Bruce do that. Bruce, please, give us your reflections on these ideas that you've heard today from the Canadian perspective, and tell us what's on your mind regarding these.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rod. Thanks so much for having me today. I think where we're going right now in Canada is, after we had something called the throne speech yesterday, which really outlined quite an aggressive plan for the country to invest in clean energy and renewables, clean tech. We're looking at some interesting investments in hydrogen, etc. But so we're generally optimistic, maybe a little bit less free market than many of your participants would be looking for. But I think what we're doing, and our approach here is really to figure out, what are the right tools for the job given the circumstances. And the one project maybe that I'll just touch on, which is it's not yet kind of a public initiative, but we've just undertaken a detailed assessment of the opportunities for decarbonization of the power system in northeastern North America. And this is an area that's quite extensive, you know, including all of New England, New York, Ontario, Quebec, and the eastern Canadian provinces. And so a very large population, large power grids, quite a different mix. And what's really interesting, what came out of that work is the recognition that we really need to do two things in combination. We need to increase the investment in the grid interties and the transmission interconnections throughout the region. And then we really need to look at how we can shift the market rules to allow for, you know, greater competition and access. And of course, you know, throughout the world, and as we've seen today in the conversations, you know, we can see just in the microcosm of the different states and provinces, you know, dramatically different market structures, different market rules, but at the end of the day, all very parochial and driven by the politics of the region. And so we really need to start to break through some of that kind of, you know, parochial political control in the power system across the regions. But one thing that came out, and this was again research done with leading utility experts across all of those regions, was the idea that if we start investing in some of this transmission interconnect capability, that we might actually, you know, be able to shift some of the market rules once that capacity is built. So the idea that each of these networks has been built kind of with their own service kind of service areas in mind, there isn't a lot of incentive to change the rules for the free flow of electricity across the jurisdiction. So that was kind of a finding that surprised me a little bit in the study. And then the idea then, of course, is that once we, and this is where a lot of the politics comes in as well, you know, we've got a utility like Hydro-Quebec that has massive hydroelectric resources, significant supply of you know, carbon-free electricity, but often it can't get to markets like New York City because it gets blocked by, you know, states like Maine and Vermont that don't want the power lines running through their states. So, so by creating what we're proposing is a regional planning process that starts getting people in a room together to understand the broader benefits in terms of decarbonizing, greater benefits to consumers, greater reliability. But that's only going to work if we have a greater flow and access and competition for the electric resources in the region. And so that's anyway, we're looking, it's still early days. We just received the study, but with something that we're looking forward to advancing with my work at the Ivy Foundation, and we're really looking to get some support from some of our American Foundation colleagues. There seems to be tremendous support from the regions right now. So I'll leave it there, Rod. I just wanted to give that quick snapshot.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
That's
Bruce.
quite a lot of material.
Yeah.
Would love
Thank
to follow up with that.
Thank you
with
very
on
much.
that.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We always appreciate your input and your commitment to competition.
Yeah, great. I have competition for another meeting now.
Okay, well, good.
Thanks for joining
Thanks
us.
so much. Yeah, care.
Okay. Allie, please, for our EarthX audience, let them know what you think.
Thanks very much. We appreciate everyone being here, offering their insights. It's been terrific. I've been updating the website. I hope everyone has a chance to look at that, trying to get everything, and we'll review the chat afterwards. The next steps, which we'll talk about, are the charrette summary will be written and posted on the website, and we'll have some video highlights to be posted after we've had a chance to edit it. We appreciate, again, EarthX TV live streaming the event, and we believe it will be available for replay. Follow-up charrettes on these single topics will be scheduled. We appreciate everyone coming in and paying attention to their emails so that they can know when those are happening. Spread the word by sharing on LinkedIn and email, and contact us directly. We want to work with you. These are complex issues and we need all of your help. Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead, please, Jeff.
Hi. Sorry, I'm in the process of spreading milkweed seeds, so we have habitat for monarch butterflies next year. I was very interested in the legislation that's being proposed on creating an agriculture market, and I'd like to speak directly with the person who was discussing that, because we're developing a pilot project in New York State, and I would love to see if we can do some interconnect.
Great, I'll put you in touch with him. That's Charles Hernick at the Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions.
Great, thank you.
Great. Julian, we can keep this conversation going for as long as the participants want. And, you know, I think it would be a great idea to focus on, we have a number of people who were in this conversation. Is Guillermo still in the conversation with us?
I am. I'm here.
Great. I mean, I think it would be great to reflect on some of the suggestions and proposals that have been raised, and you know what can be done with international action to help countries like Honduras and people like Guillermo who are trying to expand competition in their market. We know that international incentives played a role in encouraging Honduras to open up their energy market. What would be better? What would be better than an IMF deal? How do we get to policies that support open markets in energy markets throughout the world?
Can I just add a
Sure.
bit of context, which is, I mean, I think, Rod, you opened with some observations about the fact that, next year, the COP26 of the Framework Convention on Climate Change is going to be held in the UK. And I think you have this sort of interesting intersect of policies coming into that, where the UK last year passed binding legislation to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The EU in March this year created binding legislation, creating the same binding legislation. Joe Biden has made a commitment to net zero by 2050, part of his platform. So, I think there is at least a possibility, some might see it as a threat, that there will be a push to achieve binding targets of net zero carbon among some group of nations by 2050. China just a few days ago committed to net zero by 2060. So there's going to be, I think, a push for binding targets. I think a question arises as to whether that is actually the right thing to do, whether it's the best way forward. I think an argument could be made that rather than binding targets, it would be better to have international standards on certain goods and services that would result in improvements in the likelihood of innovations taking place that lead to reductions in emissions, not necessarily net zero by some specific date, but probably net zero in the not too distant future. I mean, I think that's at least a conversation to be had. I think trying to do the technology forcing to achieve net zero globally by 2060 and in some countries by 2050 is worrying. I mean, the UK Treasury estimated that it was going to cost £1 trillion by 2050, and actually even the Climate Change Committee estimated it was going to be somewhere in the region of 600 billion. So it's really not an order of magnitude difference between them, but a huge cost in either way. And other nations, it would be more costly because the UK already is actually very efficient. I'm sure in the US it would be more costly per capita to do that. So anyway, so that's sort of, I would be interested in whether there could be a conversation about what we could do collaboratively going forward to advance a more bottom-up approach to that issue. We don't need to make any concrete decisions today, but just sort of throwing it out there, because I think we've heard a number of ideas today that could form sort of the basis of part of this anyway. And then over to Guillermo. Sorry, that was just my interjection, but you know.
No, well, I'm interested in listening more. I think the case here with the IMF was one short case that helped us out, but I think there's a lot more. You know, Central America already has an energy interconnectivity agreement. There's a regional standard for the quality and quality and safety of the network. But I would like to say, you know, taking advantage of this opportunity, that a lot of what was done in the legislation 6 years ago for the opening the energy market, a good part of that came through conversations with Shankar Singh while we were talking about other issues. So just a shout out and hi Shankar, how are you doing? And you know, that work, those conversations, you can see that are still moving along today. This whole, you know, I'm more on my side. I'm more interested in seeing what other ideas would show up regarding these type of agreements, of international agreements. Would it be, you know, what about, are there agreements through, you know, nation to nation that are, or I guess state to state, that are non-contiguous states? Is there anything that we could do down that path? You know, just general questions I don't really have answers for.
Okay. Anybody else want to contribute to the conversation, or
I'd like to.
Shankar and Ron want to come back with their thoughts on where we might move forward?
I would like to ask Shankar a question if he's still with us. Oh, great, good. Well, actually, sort of a double-barreled question, because there are, you know, a couple of proposals that have been put on the table. I don't know if you heard them all. They're in the handouts that was given to you. There was the common commitments proposal. Did you have a chance to look at that in the straw proposals?
Not yet, but I can certainly look at that now.
I'm interested in your thoughts on that. The idea is, you know, to recap very briefly, is that one of the responsibilities of the UK as the host of COP26 is to raise the climate ambitions of all of these nations. And as Julian has just told us, he's not really terribly thrilled with this idea of raising commitments.
Yes.
You know, he thinks maybe standards might be better. You know, the common commitments idea says, well, you know, those commitments aren't necessarily so bad if they're accompanied by a qualification that we're going to raise commitments, but only by free market means, by means that remove, that open up markets and remove barriers to tax, trade, and anti-competitive barriers. And we're going to move towards climate policies. And this would enable nations to have more comfort, you know, adopting commitments. Those nations that are worried about the cost of these commitments, the cost of opening barriers and reducing barriers is a net economic positive for your economy. So is this, you know, this is a potential new approach to international commitments, which puts free market policies at the UN table, right? And not just one chair, it gives us a whole bench of policies to choose from. So if the UK were to lead on the idea of you know, common commitments that are conditioned on these being free market, wouldn't that help the UK free trade agenda? You know, because it would suddenly, if you get more nations into that framework, you know, it says, you know, free trade is a way to, you know, to deliver environmentally beneficial results. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I mean, I think just to pick that up and to pick up on some of the things that Julian was just talking about with respect to international standards. I mean, I think as a general rule, clearly international standards are a better approach from a global trading system standpoint than unilateral action by countries. And obviously, if you have an international standard or you're in imminent you have an international standard that's imminent, then that gives you protection under any kind of attack on the WTO technical barriers to trade agreement. So that would be a better way of proceeding. I think with respect to these commitments, these common commitments, I think you could. I mean, I could envisage something where you had a commitment where there was some linkage to a suite of other issues, and so there could be linkage to things like, we will not, and our partners will not continue to subsidize fossil fuels, if that's what's going on in certain places, a commitment to ensure that electricity markets are rendered more competitive, and the distortions that exist in electricity markets around the world are limited in some way. Some fairly hortatory language about how that might proceed. I mean, I think also linking to other international organizations that have an impact on some of those things, like, for example, obviously the obvious ones like the OECD and so on. But you could, just to think outside the box, you could also link to organizations like the International Competition Network, which is the network of competition agencies around the world. And you could say something like, well, you ought to be exercising, the national competition agencies all over the world, ought to be exercising your competition advocacy mandate to lower distortions in your own markets that are anti-competitive, including in energy markets, and eliminating regulatory barriers in energy markets that lead to higher cost and higher prices for energy. So yeah, I mean, I think you could link those common commitments to a suite of other things, but I would not see these as mutually exclusive with respect to trying to get an international standard in place for a particular product, for product characteristics. I would want to try and do both, I think. But I think it's going to be important in the UK COP26 context to make.
So Shankar, then maybe let me interject that maybe what the common commitments does is it says we're going to use free market means and standards, so that the
internationally agreed standards, yeah.
Right. So the commitment is conditioned on trying to get there using standards, using free market means, and just putting notice that these countries are not going to adopt anti-competitive policies and intense regulations to get there. They're going to try, but it's going to be a free market attempt.
And they're not going to distort their markets in ways
right.
to achieve these goals. Yeah.
Right. Or just to be in your bonnet. My other question for you, Shankar, is, considering the example of the Marshall Plan as an incentive for free trade, considering the example of the IMF deal in Honduras as an incentive for opening up the markets, what do you think? And we've raised a couple of thoughts about using clean asset bonds and loans or victory bonds and loans as a private-to-private incentive. But maybe there are some things that are better than that, or maybe that's complicated. I don't know. But what do you think about the idea of using an incentive of some sort to help, the UK achieve its free trade agenda? And what should that incentive be? I mean, I know you proposed a chunk of money to be given to the UK, to the EU, I'm sorry, to get them to agree. But I don't know what else you might think of in terms of an incentive for trade agreements that address ACMDs and competition. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in terms of incentives, I'm not sure that's a really an issue of getting a financial incentive or an incentive of that kind. But I think it's one of the advantages of getting this on the agenda for agreements is that it will help deal with some of the most pressing problems in international trade, particularly distortions and particularly the US-China trade dispute. So, I think that would be an important element of this. But I think in terms of what the UK could additionally do, and I think there was a conversation earlier on about the environmental goods agreement, environmental goods and environmental services. And certainly the UK should, and I wouldn't read into the fact they haven't done it yet as an indication they don't want to do it, but just literally a result of bandwidth. I think the UK would be very willing to jump on board that agreement, and I can help with trying to effect that. But not only the UK. I mean, once you've got the UK to pay attention to those kinds of proposals, then you also use via the UK soft power networks and Commonwealth and so on to reach other larger groupings of countries. So I think certainly that would be something the UK could do.
I think that Ron Steenblick has a couple of thoughts, and we also had a question from the audience about carbon taxes and cap and trade programs. Ronald?
Yeah, hi. I guess I'm just a little bit curious. People keep talking about standards and what they have in mind and making openings conditional on standards. If I understood, I mean, I know that the industry, like say the wind turbine industry, has often complained about various requirements that they have to meet imposed by the individual electric utilities. But is that what people have in mind? I'm not sure, because otherwise standards are, well, okay, just also to clarify, in WTO speak, a standard is voluntary. What I think that people are thinking about is what the WTO calls regulation. So if it's mandatory, it's a regulation. If it's a voluntary thing, it's a standard. So I'm just trying to figure out here what people have in mind.
Well, I mean, certainly the concept that was being discussed by Jim Connaughton is that these are voluntary standards. So in the NTTAA, what the NTTAA says is that if there are consensus standards, voluntary consensus standards that meet the objective that otherwise would be met by a regulation, those standards should be given preference to as an alternative to the adoption of a mandatory top-down regulation. So there is so standards and regulations they're sort of seen as alternatives in a sense, right? So you do have regulatory standards. There are lots of regulatory standards out there, but this is the NTTA focuses on the idea of voluntary standards as being preferable if they're adopted widely by the industry.
But are you connecting those with trade and environmental goods and tariffs and environmental goods?
So you could do, right? So you could do that in the context of, for example, a performance standard. I mean, so the one that Jim Connaughton gave an example of was actually a regulation, but it's a performance standard. It was a reduction in energy use of 70% in light bulbs. But you could create more, these voluntary standards through the various national standard setting bodies, through ISO, etc., that could then form the basis for the criteria for having a lower tariff on the goods and services, or meeting mutual recognition criteria for regulations.
If you're talking about energy, okay, so for example, pumps, there is an international standard on that, and everybody understands that. Light bulbs is pretty much also now international standards on that. If you get into things like energy efficiency of appliances and then it gets very complicated, and I can send you a link to a paper that I wrote with a couple of other people years ago. It's a mess.
Well, I mean, it's sort of a mess anyway, because you know, how do you deal with innovative products that for which there is no standard and there's no criteria? It's right, so it's a mess in any case.
Well, yeah, but that's what ISO is for.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's where okay, I won't take a lot of time in this, but that's where I have a problem with any kind of attempt to try to define what's clean and what's not clean, is that there's a lot of gray area.
Yeah.
So, you know, okay, if you're dealing with tariffs, I mean, eliminating tariffs on is just generally a good thing anyway, and you're not harming stuff. But it's well, I'll stop there. But
well, we should have it seems like we should have a follow-on conversation that doesn't involve everyone on this conversation right now. I think we've now taken up 25 minutes more of everyone's time than we'd originally committed to. So I'm conscious that we should perhaps wrap things up, unless there are any sort of pressing kind of observations or concerns. So someone wanted to know our view on carbon cap and trade versus carbon taxes. I think that's a conversation for another time. Although, I mean, maybe Rod wants to just repeat his observations about the merits of clean asset bonds and loans as an alternative to carbon taxes and cap and trade. But maybe it's better to leave it to another time.
Who is asking that, Allie?
One of the attendees asked our thoughts on Mansour Hussain, our thoughts on carbon taxes and cap and trade. And I knew it was a large discussion. And then I just put forward our general view that we're in favor of lowering taxes rather than imposing new taxes.
Well, I think that's correct. I think that one of the problems that you have with carbon taxes is the inelasticity of fossil fuel demand. And that is driven by, barriers to deployment in terms of market barriers, anti-competitive barriers, and it's also driven by technological constraints, which means that, some of the technologies are not really perfected, they're not dispatchable. There are problems that mean people have trouble shifting, and that means that your carbon tax has to be actually higher than the social cost of carbon. So that makes it a little bit difficult. And the clean free market frameworks that we're talking about directly attack the technological constraints and market barriers. So you can reduce those. And eventually, if you need to use a carbon price mechanism, it'll be much cheaper once you have the barriers removed. As far as carbon markets go, I think that the voluntary carbon markets idea that Charles Hernick proposed earlier is a really interesting one, and one that could really be very interesting to deploy with more and more companies simply making these voluntary commitments. It seems like a good way to go to make that more voluntary. That's my comment on that. But
okay.
I think I'd agree with all of that. There is an enormous economics literature on carbon taxes and cap and trade. I'm sort of the opinion that it would be preferable to replace all of the existing regulations and subsidies with a small carbon tax. Small in part because of the high short-term price elasticity of demand. So the sort of broad conclusion among economists would be that you should have a low and rising carbon tax, and the fact that it's rising and that it's rising in the future would be an incentive to innovate and supply alternatives, which would lead to a reduction in price elasticity of demand for carbon-related or carbon-emitting technologies. But I think it is a conversation for another time, and I don't want to take everyone's precious afternoon. But I think actually, mostly, I think this has proved that there is enormous potential for further conversation on this matter, on these matters, not the carbon tax matter, but around the issues that we've discussed today, Rod. So let's organise a bigger charrette that tries to drill down more concretely into some answers.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether or not this is a single charrette, or maybe there's one that focuses on things like U.S. markets and opening up U.S. markets faster, and one that's focuses on international markets. You know, it's interesting that we tried to cross-pollinate here, but there's so many people who wanted to join as experts that it would get it to be a very crowded charrette, I think, to do them both together. So in any event, we will talk about that later. And I want to thank you, Julian, as you know, one of the leading co-hosts with the Reason Foundation. It's been really incredible working with you guys, and you know, bringing in. I think that we have actually brought in quite a lot of free market thinkers into this discussion who have not really thought about these issues before, which is good. And I want to thank everyone who's participated and hung in with us. So thank you very much, and we will continue the conversation in the near future.
Absolutely. Just everyone, the final thoughts. Thank you very much for attending, for all the co-hosts, and the Clean Capitalist Leadership Council.org website. We've been trying to capture all this information, and resources are being posted up in our resources section, including a brief primer on the ACTS agreement written by Ron Steenblick. We'll have edited videos and a few reading material from Lynn Kiesling and Shankar, and others have contributed. So we hope to contribute to the effort, and see you all when we schedule this charrette coming up. Have a great day,
Thank
everybody.
you all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.